Welcome to Cryptic Library, where the shadows come alive and every story is a descent into the unknown. Here, we unravel spine-chilling tales crafted to keep you on the edge of your seat. From dark horror that will haunt your dreams to eerie creepypasta that whispers secrets of the supernatural, each story draws you deeper into the terrifying realms of the Cryptic Library. So, if you crave tales that chill, disturb, and intrigue, hit that subscribe button, grab a light if you dare, and step inside.
Jackson Browne was a man of reason, methodical, logical, grounded in the stark realities of life. As a seasoned private investigator, he had unraveled mysteries that would have left the faint-hearted trembling. It was the unusual cases that intrigued him most, those that teetered on the edge of the paranormal, those that defied explanation. But nothing had prepared him for the nightmarish case that would consume him for the rest of his life. The assignment was simple at first. A local family had hired Jackson to follow a man who had been acting increasingly strange. Things had gone missing, stray animals, even a few humans. At first, the disappearances were chalked up to accidents or just odd occurrences. But as time passed, a pattern emerged. Pets vanished without a trace, and when the authorities searched the area, all they found was silence, an eerie, unnatural silence. No footprints, no blood, nothing but an unsettling sense that something dark was lurking beneath the surface. The man Jackson was hired to follow was an enigma, a creature of habit who spent his days wandering the wilderness surrounding the town. He lived on the outskirts of town in an old, decrepit cabin, a place that seemed to retreat from the world like it was trying to hide from its own history. The locals spoke of him in whispers, some called him a recluse, others a madman. But what Jackson didn't know was that the man in question was something far worse. On his first day tailing the man, Jackson found himself sitting in the woods just beyond the cabin. He observed from a distance as the man, whom he later learned was named Garret Hale, lumbered about in the wilderness, his movements unnaturally precise, as though he knew the land better than he knew his own hands. He seemed to be searching for something, or someone. As the days passed, Jackson grew more intrigued, but also increasingly disturbed. Garret never interacted with anyone. He made no attempt to socialize, never ventured into town. Yet every evening, Jackson would catch glimpses of him walking back toward his cabin, sometimes carrying something strange, something he couldn't quite make out. It wasn't until the third day of watching that he saw the thing Garret was hauling across his shoulders, an animal. A large limp dog, its body covered in deep gashes and bite marks, as though it had been attacked by something much larger and far more vicious. Jackson's stomach churned as he watched Garret drag the mangled animal into his cabin, but something kept him in place. A dark, unexplainable curiosity. It wasn't until the next day that he realized how deep this nightmare would go. That evening, Jackson noticed something else. The door to Garret's cabin had been left ajar, and from the shadows of the trees, Jackson saw Garret crouched over something in the dim light of his cabin. The glow of a fire flickered through the window, casting strange shadows on the walls. Jackson, ever cautious, drew closer. His breath caught in his throat as he saw Garret hunched over the dead animal, its fur soaked with blood, its legs stiff with rigor mortis. He was muttering to himself in an eerie, guttural language, the syllables unintelligible but heavy with malice. Then Jackson's heart stopped. Garret's hands, his hands, were not human. At least, not anymore. The fingers had elongated, twisted, and gnarled into something that looked more like claws. The nails, blackened and sharp, dug into the animal's flesh as he tore at it with a grotesque savagery. His face was obscured by a shadow, but Jackson could see his lips, wet with blood, pulling into a grotesque grin. It wasn't until Garret stood up that Jackson realized the full horror of what he was witnessing. Garret Hale, the man he had been hired to follow, was not human. At least not entirely. Garret's form seemed to distort in the flickering firelight. His skin, pale and drawn tight against his bones, stretched unnaturally. The fabric of his shirt seemed to shift and slither like it was alive, as if something beneath was moving, fighting to break free. And it was then that Jackson realized, what Garret was doing was not merely an act of feeding or hunting. Garret Hale was performing some ritual, and as Jackson looked closer, he could see that the disfigured, bloodied remains of the dog were not just being consumed. They were being altered. The carcass twitched unnaturally as Garret chanted louder, and Jackson's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to run, but something kept him glued to the spot, his legs like lead. The man, thing, Before him tore into the animal with an almost religious fervor, pulling its skin away from the muscle and bones with horrifying ease. Jackson felt bile rise in his throat as Garret began to stitch the skin back together, reassembling it like a twisted puzzle. But the pieces didn't fit. They weren't meant to fit. Jackson couldn't look away as the skin was reshaped, and he saw the dog's body begin to twitch and squirm, reshaping itself into something new. Something alive. Jackson's breath caught as the creature began to move, its skin now stretched too tightly, its eyes opening wide with a vicious, malevolent intelligence. The body jerked and spasmed like a puppet controlled by unseen strings, and in the flickering shadows, Jackson could see something that shouldn't have been. The creature, wearing the skin of the dog, now seemed to be aware of him. Its eyes, black as coal, wide with a hunger that made Jackson's blood run cold, locked with his. And in that moment, Garret, still hunched over the creature, turned toward the window. His eyes gleamed with a wild intensity, and his lips parted in a sickening grin. Jackson knew then, without a doubt, that Garret Hale was no longer a man. He was a skinwalker, a creature of ancient evil, capable of wearing the skin of any animal it chose, becoming something else entirely. But Garret had transcended that. He was becoming something else. Jackson barely had time to react as Garret's voice rose into a guttural growl, an incantation that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath him. The creature, now a twisted, deformed abomination, snarled and lunged forward, its claws scraping the window as it growled, hungry and bloodthirsty. Jackson barely made it to his car. His legs shook as he scrambled to start the engine, his mind a whirl of terror. The world around him seemed to blur as he sped away, the image of Garret's eyes, those eyes, burning into his memory. He didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. The images replayed in his mind, Garret's transformation, the twisted creature, the ritualistic slaughter of the dog. He called the local sheriff the next morning, but when they arrived at the cabin, there was nothing. No sign of Garret, no trace of the creature. Just an empty cabin, covered in the thick, pungent stench of blood. Jackson returned to the city, the case unsolved, but he couldn't escape the nightmares. The nights where Garret's twisted, skinless grin haunted him, where the creature's black eyes followed his every move. He quit his job, vanished from the world. But Garret Hale's eyes, those unearthly, soulless eyes, would follow him forever. And sometimes, when the moon was full, Jackson could hear the distant howl of the thing Garret had become, calling for him in the darkness. Jackson never returned to the town. The case never made it to the press, and Garret Hale was forgotten by all, except for those who knew better. Because in the shadows of the woods, something was still waiting for him. Waiting to wear his skin,